You're listening to the Mind Over Murder podcast.
My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the unsolved Colonial Parkway Murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group, together with Kristin Dilley.
My name is Kristin Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas. Welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Kristin Dilley.
And I'm Bill Thomas.
And I'm rasping just a little bit today because I've had a long day and I'm sick. So please excuse the rasp in my throat. Hopefully it just reminds you of Katharine Hepburn.
By the time everyone hears this, you'll be 100% healthy.
I certainly hope so. In the meantime, though, do I sound like Katharine Hepburn? Like even the littlest bit? Absolutely.
That was the first thing that came to mind.
Yeah, that's the right answer. Or more, am I doing a Lauren Bacall kind of thing? Tallulah Bankhead, any of the old starlets, I'm fine with.
Some of our younger listeners may be saying, Tallulah who?
Wait, who's Lauren Bacall? What?
To me, Tallulah Bankhead is probably a borderline obscure Hollywood reference to start with.
Yeah, you're talking to a film teacher after all. Yeah, I've been trying for years to come up with actresses with raspy voices that I can compare myself to, and it's those three, pretty much.
Since so many people had stage names back then, I can't help but think, is Tallulah Bankhead really her real name?
Oh, it would have to be a stage name, I'm sure. If we looked it up, probably we would find it's like Jane Smith or something like that.
Yeah, seriously.
You know what Cary Grant's original name was, right?
I do, but now I've forgotten it. What is it?
Archie Leach.
Yeah, I remember it was just really a terrible, bland name. Cary Grant. That's a good movie star name.
It is a good movie star name. And I wish I had a nice movie star face and voice and paycheck to go along with these things. Alas, all I can do is sound like a cheap imitation Katharine Hepburn.
You sound better than that. So what are we going to talk about today, Kristin Dilley?
We're going to go ahead and run an episode of Ask Us Anything because, as always, we have a number of people who have reached out and said, hey, I've got a question about, and our answer for that is we have an answer, or we're going to try to have an answer.
There have been fantastic questions and great discussion on our Mind Over Murder and especially the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page. Lots of questions, lots of opinion, and we welcome it all. There have been a few odd references, which we've actually deleted. I don't know why one person in particular seems obsessed with people having chips inserted in their bodies. But that kind of thing, that just goes away. I'm sorry. I don't know what you're rambling about, but we're going to take it off the page. We are very interested, though, in people's opinions about the Colonial Parkway murders, the status of the investigation. All of that stuff is of great interest to our audience. And based on the volume of questions, it seems like there's a lot of interest.
Absolutely. And if you are one of those weird bot or troll accounts that keeps posting weird random videos in our comments, please stop. It's so obnoxious. And all we're going to do is block you.
Yeah, one after another.
Oh, man. We're going to go ahead and kick it off with a question from Jessica, which I think is a really excellent one. Jessica asks, how long before the Colonial Parkway murders does law enforcement think Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. was active? My mom grew up in the area, and she remembers in the late 1970s being fearful of going onto the parkway after dark. She does not remember any particular instance, but her and her friends know it wasn't safe after dark. I wonder if he was active in the 1970s. Was he maybe harassing people back then as well?
Well, there's two parts to the answer, I think. First of all, in terms of the Colonial Parkway, so this is in the Tidewater area of Virginia where the 4 double homicides that we call the Colonial Parkway murders occurred, the earliest report we have as family members seems to be from 1982. We have people reporting into us that they were harassed by a man who is clearly Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. It's a short, muscular man wearing almost like mechanics clothes, like a jumpsuit, harassing, one could even say attacking, a couple near the Yorktown Memorial. That seems to be around 1982 is the first report that we've heard about. Now, I'm sure law enforcement has heard about additional reports, although, again, I find myself so frustrated that there are so many of these reports about couples being harassed on the Colonial Parkway and in Yorktown and in surrounding areas. It's still amazing to me that law enforcement, specifically the FBI and the National Park Service, were not able to put this together, that these were all the same man, Wilmer, attacking, harassing, however you want to put it, but in many cases terrifying these young couples. I think as far back as 82 is what we have for reports. Now, there has been discussion, but I want to make it clear here, this is our opinion, not necessarily law enforcement's opinion. But there have been discussions in Lancaster County, especially in the last few months, since Wilmer was identified as a serial killer and as the murderer of Robin Edwards and David Knobling, as well as Teresa Howell. There have been discussions about whether or not Wilmer may have been involved in a 1976 murder of a couple, the Rogers family, in Kilmarnock, Virginia, which is right nearby. This murder involves an airline pilot, Dale Rogers, and his wife, Charlotte, who had renovated a beautiful home on the water and are considered not from there. They are outsiders, if you will. They were shotgunned to death at their home in what appears to be a robbery. But the odd thing is they live literally right down the road. It's described to me as a few acres away from where the Wilmers were living at the time. So it's a very strange coincidence. And one of the things I've said about Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. and perhaps other members of his family is they seem to be surrounded by unsolved murders. There are a lot of unsolved murders for a beautiful rural area like Lancaster County to have this many unsolved murders as far back as the 70s. By my calculation, in 1976, Alan Wade Wilmer would have been about 22 years old, and his older brother Keith would have been a couple of years older. So they are certainly demographically close enough in age to be young adults. And the weird thing is they are right down the street, road is probably a better way to put that, from the site where the Rogers family were gunned down. We're not saying it's definitive, but when you're looking back at the Mary Harding case from 1985, you actually have to roll the clock further back to look at some of these other unsolved murders in the area and think to yourself, were the Wilmers involved here?
Agreed. If you're surrounded by unsolved murders, I think that definitely bears asking the question, is there correlation here or is there causation here? Next question comes from Patricia. This is very interesting, I think. She asks, do you think that Wilmer might possibly have been protected, so to speak, by local law enforcement? Can you give us any details about what you have heard about the Wilmer brothers or his family in general?
I don't want to go too far here. We've heard from a number of people that have known the Wilmers for years. We've mentioned our new friends from Lancaster County who've reached out to us to say, I went to school with the Wilmers or I live down the road from the Wilmers. And they've had a number of observations, particularly about the three brothers. This would be Keith Wilmer, Alan Wade Wilmer Sr., the middle brother, and their younger brother, Timothy. The two younger brothers, Alan and Timothy, are both dead. And only Keith Wilmer, the oldest of the three, now Keith's in his 70s. The characterizations that we've heard are not particularly positive. There seems to be, in that generation specifically, a penchant for violence and a suspicion of being involved in a number of different rapes and murders over the years. That doesn't mean that all three brothers are guilty of anything, although we know definitively that Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. is a serial killer and a rapist. And of course, he died in 2017. Interestingly, his brother Timothy, the youngest of the three, died almost a year to the day after his brother Alan, under circumstances that we are still researching. It appears that he may have died in an automobile accident and that he may have been living over in Newport News. He had lived in Mechanicsville, which is over near Richmond, for a number of years. But in the last part of his life, he seems to have been living in the Newport News area, which puts him in the Tidewater area.
Yes, it does. Another interesting question from Melanie, who asks, has law enforcement ever been able to track down Wilmer's old truck or other previous vehicles? There was definitely a white van stalking folks on the Parkway back then. Did Wilmer own a white van to our knowledge?
We don't know that for a fact. We do know that Alan Wade Wilmer did drive a number of different vehicles and even hung out at one point at a wrecking yard, a junkyard, with a number of friends. They used to sit there and drink beer and tell stories. And we actually don't know where the green truck is. This is the truck that's featured so prominently in the materials from the FBI and the Virginia State Police. We've heard about local folks who've purchased vehicles from Alan Wade Wilmer Sr., including a pearl-colored Chevrolet pickup truck. I don't know where the green truck that shows up so much in these wanted posters and other vehicles, I don't know where they all ended up. It appears that he may have sold them or they may have been scrapped. I can't help but think all those times that he was hanging out at that junkyard, if that's perhaps where they ought to be looking for the 1966 Dodge, the blue-green truck that we've seen so much in the materials that were distributed to the press.
This one's interesting. This question comes from Emmy Lou, who asks, have any character witnesses come forward with regard to Alan Wade Wilmer Sr.?
A number of people have come forward to law enforcement and to the families, our families. I wouldn't say too many people had much good to say about Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. at all. Some of the people that have known him for years have said that he could be shy and withdrawn and very quiet with people that he didn't know well. It certainly sounds like he had a very rough upbringing. We've heard a lot about the fact that these three men, Keith, Alan, and Timothy, their father was particularly cruel to the sons, especially Alan for some reason. We don't really know what that's about. The two older boys, Keith and Alan, ended up working on the water as watermen very young. That is when they were teenagers. And then their youngest brother, Timothy, seems to have escaped some of that really hardcore manual labor that was expected of the three boys. That seemed to be mostly focused on Keith and Alan. Very interesting that people that have known the family for years have pointed out that their father was extremely rough, particularly on the two older boys. And for some reason, his cruelty, and that's the word they used, seemed to be directed at Alan. Keith was the oldest, he was the favorite, and then Tim or Timothy was the youngest, and he was the baby, and he got away with the most. I think about my own family where I was the second oldest. We felt like the younger kids in my family, my younger brother Jack and our younger sister Kathy, we felt like they had it a lot easier than we had. Mm-hmm. Not that my parents were hard on us, just in terms of, I don't know, mowing lawns and doing chores and that sort of thing. The two older boys, myself and my brother Richard, we felt like we got hit with more of the brunt of that. And then later on, and this was a subject of some consternation, we felt like that Jack and Kathy got away with a lot more than we ever had because, of course, we paved the way. Mm-hmm. So some of that dynamic may be happening in the Wilmer family as well. Keith is the favorite. He's the oldest. Alan, for some reason, is the black sheep, and he's very poorly treated. And I don't mean to make light of that. As I understand it, it was not easy for him. And then Timothy, the youngest, he skates by being the baby.
Related to that is a comment from Jim, who says, I would be interested in hearing stories about Wilmer from people who knew or worked with him. What was he like as a friend? What was he like to work for, etc.? Bill, have you received any intel over the last couple of weeks that would shed any light on that particular question?
Yes, some. Now, I don't want to make it sound like I'm an expert on all things Wilmer. All I can do is reflect what people are telling us, but a number of people have reached out to us. One person had some very interesting things to say. They had worked for Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. when he ran his tree business. So he did tree cutting, clearing of land, and they had said that they worked directly for him. Interestingly, they made a couple of observations about the fact that they were actually physically afraid of Wilmer. Now, Wilmer's kind of short in stature, but he's very powerfully built. And this guy who worked for him said that even though he probably had 6 inches on him in terms of height or reach, he said he absolutely would not have wanted to take him on in a physical altercation because he was so incredibly strong and agile. He would do things like climb up a tree with just a chainsaw and no safety equipment, but he was so physically strong he could clamber up a tree with a chainsaw slung over his shoulder and get up to the top of the tree or wherever they were trimming, start up the chainsaw. And so this was dangerous.
Wow.
And yet Wilmer had the confidence and the physicality that he would just clamber directly up a tree. This guy described him as almost being like a monkey, like having that kind of physical strength. And then he'd get up there and he'd trim whatever branches they were lopping off. He also said some other very interesting things. He said that Wilmer preferred to do business in cash, which we've heard from a variety of people, some of whom hired him to do tree care and clear cutting, that kind of thing. Wilmer always preferred to be paid in cash, and that he used to carry $5,000 in cash in a bag in the truck, whatever truck he was driving that day, and a handgun, which I found very interesting.
I do too.
$5,000 was the usual amount of cash in this bag, which he would use to pay bills and also to collect funds that were due him. And then he always had a loaded handgun in the cab of whatever truck he was driving. The implication to me was that this was a guy who was not to be messed with. He could take care of himself physically, and then on top of that, he was always carrying a loaded revolver. I found that very striking.
I do as well. My parents just had some tree work done over at their house. They are surrounded by a lot of very tall trees, and my stepdad took great delight the other day in showing me pictures that he had taken of one of these guys who's doing the tree work, climbing way up to the top of, it had to be at least 100 feet high of this tree, and was just happily up there sawing away, trimming branches. I think you have to be a certain type of fearless to be willing to embark on that kind of work. So that actually doesn't surprise me all that much. Very interesting. The next question comes from Kim. She asks, do you know if any of Wilmer's family, wife, brother, or kids, have spoken to law enforcement since the January announcement? If so, were they happy to assist, or did they not want to talk? Have you been privy to any conversations? Have you tried to speak to the family directly?
I know the family has spoken to law enforcement several times, and law enforcement would include the FBI, the Virginia State Police, and probably the Lancaster Police Department as well. My understanding is that the family has been cooperative and have tried to provide assistance. You can imagine this has to be quite a shock to the family. They even issued a statement saying this man, and they're referring to Alan Wade Wilmer, this is not the man that we knew. I think it's quite possible that this guy lived a double life. At one point, he was married for about 6 years, from his early 20s to his late 20s, and he had 2 kids and then was divorced, and then he never remarried, although he did have some relationships with women over the years. But he, I think, was capable of having this kind of duality where he had a career as a waterman. He had this business doing the tree service. So he's out fishing, crabbing, oystering. He also works on the land, particularly the tree maintenance. And at the same time, there's this really dark side of him, obviously. He's confirmed to have been a serial killer and a rapist. And I believe strongly that if the FBI and the Virginia State Police work this case hard, and I hope they are, I think he will be identified as the offender in other unsolved rapes and murders in Virginia and perhaps elsewhere. There's at least 2 sides to this man. the guy who's out there working perhaps a kind of a lonely existence, but he's out there making a living. And then at the same time, there's this incredibly dark, frightening side of him as well. The reports that we've gotten are from people that have known the family and known Wilmer in particular for a number of years. But the information that we're getting back from law enforcement is that the family are doing their best to cooperate with the various agencies, answer questions. That I know they've provided what they had in terms of letters, photographs, anything that was remaining in the house. The son lived in the house at the time of the FBI, Virginia State Police raids in early January, but that was the house that Wilmer Sr. had lived in previously, which is, I think, one of the key places that law enforcement wanted to search. As I understand it, the family's done everything they can to cooperate.
Next question is from Lauren. I know they haven't loaded Wilmer Sr.'s DNA into CODIS, but is there any chance they've loaded his profile to one of the DNA search sites used for genetic genealogy? Or was it a straight lab test off his known sample that identified him?
Law enforcement hasn't explained all of this to us, but I think it's important to go back over how we believe this identification came together. And that is that it's probably over a year ago now, the Virginia State Police and the Virginia Department of Forensic Science applied for and received a SAKI grant, S-A-K-I grant, Sexual Assault Kit Initiative grant. These are designed to provide funding for outside labs to assist in testing rape kits and seeking identification of offenders. In the Robin Edwards David Knobling example, the tests were conducted on the rape kit from Robin Edwards, which could have indicated, as we've known, a potential offender in that case. And this is something that the Edwards and Knobling families have been lobbying for several years, and we've certainly supported them in this regard. After we saw the potential of the Golden State Killer case, when the offender there, Joseph D'Angelo, was identified as a result of using forensic investigative genetic genealogy, we saw that there could be an opportunity within the Colonial Parkway murders to identify an offender or offenders. The evidence was sent out to one DNA lab. They were unsuccessful. This would be an independent lab. And then a second attempt was made as part of this SAKI grant, and an outside lab was successful in creating a DNA profile. We believe, based on what we've heard, that they then turned that material over to another lab who did the forensic investigative genetic genealogy. So at some point then, first lab fails, sends the evidence back. Second lab succeeds and then passes it off to, we believe, a third team who do the investigative genetic genealogy. And at that point, we believe that's when Wilmer is identified as a result of that genealogy work. Now they have an offender and a working DNA profile, and they start doing one-to-one comparisons. And that's when they discover that the same offender who raped and killed Robin Edwards and David Knobling is also responsible for the 1989 murder of Teresa Howell in Hampton, Virginia. That's the situation that starts at the Zodiac Club that evening. So we're frustrated because we'd like to see Alan Wade Wilmer Sr.'s DNA uploaded into the CODIS system. As we understand it, the regulations say that unless you've been convicted of a felony, your profile can't go into CODIS. We think this is a ridiculous rule and this needs to be changed. Interestingly, and we discussed this recently with Ashley Spence, who was a guest here on Mind Over Murder, the rules vary from state to state. So we're talking about the Commonwealth of Virginia's regulations regarding CODIS. We actually think that in this situation where we have an offender who is a confirmed serial killer according to FBI standards, he's killed 3 people in 2 different incidents, and we're rock solid certain on that, we believe that his profile should be put into CODIS, but that has not happened yet. So what law enforcement is saying is they're doing one-to-one comparisons. We don't think that's a very efficient way to go about this, but it's all we've got right now until we change those regulations.
Agreed. Excellent question from Lauren.
You're listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll be right back after this word from our sponsors. We're back here at Mind Over Murder.
Moving on to other types of evidence, I think this is an interesting question too. This comes from Bill, who says, I've heard nothing about fingerprint evidence in any of these cases. That seems strange to me. What do we know about fingerprint evidence and its use or not use in this case?
Well, this Bill that asked the question isn't Bill Thomas.
No, not Bill Thomas.
I'm not an expert on all things fingerprints, but I can tell you what I know in Kathy and Becky's crime scene, which I know a bit more detail about. There are at least 150 partial and full prints taken from Kathy and Becky's crime scene, primarily from the car. You have to think about Kathy's Honda or any vehicle is often a good source of fingerprint evidence because of the shiny metal surfaces and also interior surfaces in the car. So I know there are fingerprints, definitely in Kathy and Becky's case. I'm sure the other vehicles would have been fingerprinted at the time. And I know there were fingerprint cards that were created because there were some complaints about the fact that they were sloppily handled from some of the other families. So there are fingerprints and there is fingerprint evidence. I don't know if there are fingerprints from Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. or not. Because remember, as law enforcement pointed out, he was never arrested for a felony. He may have been arrested for some misdemeanors. Fingerprints are a little bit of an open issue because you'd have to have an offender's fingerprints to compare against the fingerprint evidence in the various crime scenes in the Parkway murders.
Let's go ahead and move to possible linkage between one of our pet suspects and Alan Wade Wilmer Sr.
Which
Carla
one?
asks, Carla asks, can you please tell us something about the possible link between Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. and Ron Little?
We're still looking into this. Now, remember,
Yeah.
Ron Little, if you're not familiar with him, is the...
Chapter and verse.
Yeah, we'll do the short version here, is an oddball who has been linked to a number of the Colonial Parkway murders. He actually placed himself into the middle of the Colonial Parkway murders investigation before being deported back to his native New Zealand in 1989. And of course, he's the one who purchased Liberty Security, later called Advanced Security, in the late 1980s. Ultimately, he was deported back to New Zealand, and he died a couple of years ago. Interestingly, his family has reached out to us as a result of the Mind Over Murder podcast and ended up sending me evidence, which I passed along to the FBI. So it's been a very interesting dynamic out of nowhere to hear from the family of Ron Little, and they told me at the time that he was quite ill and he passed away from a recurrence of cancer. This is about 2 years ago, I guess now.
Mm-hmm.
We've been trying to look at, are there any intersections between suspects? Now, we know that Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. is linked to the Robin Edwards and David Knobling murder, as well as the Teresa Howell murder. We believe that he met Teresa Howell at the Zodiac Club or Club Zodiac in Hampton. And there's a possibility that he may have waited outside and looked for someone that was inebriated. And so he may have attacked her as a result of seeing her outside the club. One of the things that's very curious is we're getting information that Ron Little appears to have been a regular at the Zodiac as well. Other suspects whose names have been mentioned over the years, and we typically will not mention living suspects because we're not here to trash anyone's reputation.
Mm-hmm.
A number of people whose names have been mentioned in connection with the Colonial Parkway murders seem to be regulars at the Club Zodiac, which is very odd. So that we almost feel like it's still early going and we're asking people a lot of questions. I'm actually going to be talking to some more people in the next couple of weeks about this. There almost seems like there's a nexus around this club. So we've got the Ivory Horse, if I have the name, and then next door is an after-hours club, members only. I think there was a certain degree of lax enforcement of what constituted a member. It was a place where you could be consuming alcohol till well past closing time at regular bars. The Ivory Horse and then the next door club, which is Club Zodiac, could be a situation where you could go from one bar then to the after hours club, and you could be there till 4 or 5 in the morning, as I understand it. really interesting. We're going to be trying to explore this more about how many of these people whose names have been mentioned in connection with this series of murders seem to also be connected to the Zodiac.
Good question here from Connie, but I'm not sure if we know the answer to this one, but let's throw it out there anyway. Did the same polygrapher who examined Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. administer the test or tests to the National Park Service Rangers who were questioned when Kathy Thomas and Rebecca Dowski, Keith Call, and Cassandra Hailey were murdered?
It's a real good question, and man, would I like to know the answer. I don't know the answer. We do know who the polygrapher was.
Yes.
Who gave the test in the Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. example. I don't know. It makes me want to ask, so we'll see if we can get an answer on that one.
Also, with regard to the park rangers, again from Connie, have the FBI or any other law enforcement agency requested DNA samples from those same park rangers once DNA testing became more advanced?
I want to say they have not, because I am aware of at least one of those park rangers has been very resistant to providing his DNA, which I personally find infuriating. Years ago, when the FBI approached me and my brothers, Richard and Jack, the surviving members of my family, for our DNA samples, we willingly gave them to the FBI, and they came to our respective offices and collected our DNA. I actually think, and forgive me, I'm the brother of a murder victim here. I'm not a lawyer, and I'm certainly not in law enforcement. I actually think you should be required to give your DNA if you're going to work in law enforcement, just for clearance purposes, just to avoid confusion. The fact that a National Park Service ranger would resist giving his or her DNA in a murder investigation, I actually find that infuriating. I think they should be required to give their DNA.
Yeah, I agree.
It just comes with the territory. In the same way, I would be very surprised that if law enforcement people aren't required to give their fingerprints. Same thing. DNA is just a genetic fingerprint is all it is. But I know for a fact, at least one of those now retired National Park Service Rangers is completely offended that they would ask him for his DNA. And my attitude's, really? Just cough it up and move on. You didn't kill anybody. The only reason you'd have a concern about that is if you did. I don't know why law enforcement can't be just required to provide their DNA. That's it. Full stop. Move on.
Yeah, I agree. 100%. Celeste asked, I'd be very curious to know if Alan Wade Wilmer kept souvenirs of his killings. Based on what you know about murder and what you know about Alan Wade Wilmer Sr., do you think he's the type to keep souvenirs?
I don't think I know Wilmer well enough to say that. I know that this is something that law enforcement has always been looking for in the Colonial Parkway murders. And they've been very specific. I won't be very specific about what they were looking for, but I know they were looking for souvenirs. Over the years, profilers and investigators have talked to us about collectors, is one of the expressions they use, people that collect souvenirs. And sometimes it's hard to understand the mentality of someone like this, but I think this is a way of hanging on to some small token of an item that belonged to or was there or used as part of the murder, and this allows them to revisit that. So I don't know Wilmer well enough to know if he's that kind of collector. I do know that the law enforcement agencies have been looking for evidence like that could have been taken from the crime scenes in the Colonial Parkway murders.
Yeah, I agree with your assessment on that, Bill. I don't think we have enough information, and I would go more into that if my voice weren't ready to give out. Jen asks, what are your honest opinions and thoughts about the Parkway adjacent cases? I would love to know more about those. And I'm thinking when she says Parkway adjacent, she's referring to Laurie Ann Powell and Brian Pettinger. I hope I'm not presuming too much by saying that, but I'm pretty sure that's what she means because that's what I've been calling them for years.
By the way, when we say adjacent, we don't mean to have any value judgment attached to that. All we're saying is these cases took place around the same time and in the same locations as the Colonial Parkway murders. They're not double homicides. They certainly happened nearby and right at the same time. As a matter of fact, Brian Pettinger and Lorianne Powell murders actually bracket the disappearance of Keith Call and Cassandra Hailey, if I'm not mistaken, Kristin.
Yeah, they do. Absolutely. When we talk about Parkway adjacent cases, it does mean exactly what Bill just said. Anything that is similar to or could be related to the Parkway. To be perfectly honest, Jen, now that I've taken a look at some of the other cases from this area, I think that we may have more Parkway adjacent cases than we previously used to. I do think Lorianne Powell and Brian Pettinger do think that it is entirely possible Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. is responsible for those, but I think that we may need to expand our definition of Parkway adjacent in the future, because I think that there are more that he might be responsible for.
One thing that makes me very curious is that Lorianne Powell and Brian Pettinger both worked for Liberty Security, so they worked with Ron Little. I think there's a possibility that Ron Little may have used the Colonial Parkway murders because if he knew that Brian Pettinger and Lorianne Powell, these young people that had worked for Liberty Security, knew something about questionable behavior by the owners of Liberty Security, he might have used the fact that these other murders were going on at the same time. And remember, we talked about this a minute ago. He very much inserted himself in a very public way in the Colonial Parkway murders. And I think he may have been trying to obscure his original intent. Now I'm talking about Little in killing those young people that worked with him at Liberty Security. And they might have had information about wrongdoing at Liberty Security, whether it was cheating on their taxes or cheating their clients or theft or drug dealing or any number of other things that I think Little was into. I think that seems more likely to me than anything. One other thing I should mention is that Teresa Howell now is linked to the Colonial Parkway murders, and I don't know if we continue to use that word adjacent or not. I know some people have gotten very frustrated lately because they point something out, which I understand, which is that the Colonial Parkway murders, the name itself is confusing because not all of these double homicides happened on the Colonial Parkway. I didn't make up the term. It was a media creation from back in the 80s. Certainly there was a very strong possibility, and I think there's an even greater one now, that these murders are linked. Alan Wade Wilmer could be responsible for all of the Colonial Parkway murders and additional murders like Teresa Howell's. We may have a very serious situation here where we have a serial killer, and then we have other people who are taking advantage of the fact that there's a serial killer at work in the Tidewater area of Virginia from 1986 to 1989, and likely starting before and ending well after the murders we think of as the Colonial Parkway murders. I get that people are frustrated. I think for clarity's sake, I think it makes more sense to continue referring to these murders by the name they are known as. And this is one of the reasons why I was so frustrated with the FBI and the Virginia State Police for suddenly declaring that we're going to call the murder of Robin Edwards and David Knobling the Isle of Wight murders, which no one's ever called them that. So let's not make up new names while we're at it. That just adds to the confusion.
Yeah, agreed. And I think we need to do maybe whole entire or half of an episode just based on this sudden flip decision that they've made. Let's completely divorce it from the Colonial Parkway murders and call it something else. I don't understand it. Or rather, I'm sorry, I have a theory about why that might be, but I'm not willing to antagonize our friends at the FBI and the VSP who are definitely listening to us right now. Good evening, analysts. Thank you for listening.
Yes, thank you all for listening. We appreciate it.
We actually have some questions that fall under the anything part of Ask Us Anything because they are not related to the Colonial Parkway murders specifically, but they are related to crime and various other things. Let's start with one from Annie. This is specifically for you, Bill.
Oh, gosh.
She says, from one author to another, when is this book of yours coming out? With the developments in the cases, are you waiting to see if there is a conclusion before you declare it done?
I'm waiting until there's a conclusion before I declare it done. The other thing is there's been so much information just flooding us that it's going to take me a while to sort all this out. So that's my excuse for not having produced a book yet.
Considering that you've been pretty much perennially busy since January 8th, I don't imagine that there would be a lot of time to write in there either, which also, by the way, is my excuse for not having a book done either. I am a teacher. I have no time for such things.
And hardly any voice left.
And hardly any voice left. Annie asked me in particular, what is my favorite fictional crime movie and why? It's Silence of the Lambs.
Oh, that's a great one. I think I've only seen Silence of the Lambs once all the way through.
It's amazing. And it came on my radar in a college film class. I had never seen it. But as soon as I watched that opening shot of Jodie Foster pulling her way up the rope ladder on the Yellow Brick Road chorus, I was sold. I wanted to be an FBI agent. I wanted to be Jodie Foster. I wanted to run the Yellow Brick Road. You name it, I wanted it. But yeah, it's got to be Silence of the Lambs for me. Do you have one, Bill?
I think it's probably Zodiac, actually.
Okay.
The David Fincher film, which
is great.
Is great. Some of that stuff gets dark for me. I know that might be hard to believe, but some of that stuff's kind of disturbing. And then, of course, my wonderful partner, Pamela, will often push back when I want to watch something that's true crime related. We actually started watching this latest season of True Detective. And
with Jodie Foster's
in that as well.
Yeah.
And it's really dark. So I've gotten some pushback from Pamela on watching that. She's like, you can watch that anytime you want. In other words, but not with her in the room.
I also like this question that Annie asked, and it's very germane to a terribly tragic case that happened 2 weeks ago, I think. Annie asks, as a woman who goes running alone, what are some of the recommended items outside of the cell phone that you would recommend carrying on you? This is something I've given a lot of thought to recently, Annie, and I am a minimalist runner, which means I do run with my cell phone and my keys, but that's pretty much it. I have started thinking about whether or not I need to carry a tactical pen or a foldable baton or a taser or something like that. I have not come to any conclusions as to whether or not I'm going to carry anything with me outside of my keys, which I always carry between my fingers with the pointy end down in case someone bothers me. One of the things that I do recommend, and this sort of circumvents the rule that a lot of women are told, which is that you shouldn't wear earbuds when you run. I have to have music when I run, otherwise I'm not going to find my rhythm. But my loving boyfriend bought me a pair of what are called open run bone conduction headphones. And I love these because they don't go in your ears. They press against your temples and the sound conducts off the bones in your skull so that you can still hear what is going on with your ears. I can hear everything that's going on behind me. I can hear traffic noise. I can hear bicyclists. I can hear other runners. But I'm still getting the music because it's bouncing off the bones of my skull and I'm hearing it in my head that way. It sounds really weird, but
it does sound really weird and not very appealing.
No, it actually, honest to goodness, I bought a pair for another friend of mine who goes running. He loved the quality. He said, this sounds better than my normal earbuds. It's got the added benefit of you never have to worry, are your AirPods going to slip out of your ears? Mm-hmm. The bone conduction ones loop over your ears and press against your temples. And so you'll never lose them. The sound, I think, is better than anything you would get off of AirPods. And it's great. And it's a way that I can circumvent you should be running in total silence. No, I can run with music in, but I can also hear everything that's behind me. I've been able to hear bicycles approaching and cars and various other things. So I'd recommend that for any woman who wants to run, but also needs to have music. I have ones called Open Run by Shock, and they are excellent. Best money that you can invest in yourself as a runner. And then we're going to finish up our Ask Us Anythings with 2 questions from Julie. Julie asks, Bill, what's your go-to album when you're overwhelmed?
Boy.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm looking at these thousands of LPs in my library here. There's a lot. I'm a music fan through and through. I don't know if there's a go-to for when I'm feeling overwhelmed. One of my favorite rock bands is a Scottish band called Dilley.
Okay.
Who had a number of big hits in the 1990s, Always the Last to Know, which is how I feel about the FBI most of the time. That's one that comes to mind. There's an album of theirs called Change Everything, which is also appropriate. That came out, I think, in 1994 that I'm particularly fond of. But there's a lot. I'm a music person through and through, and of course, many of them I worked in the music industry for a number of years. I think I have a lot of favorites. I don't know. Elementary came to mind when I was answering the question anyway.
Okay. And she also asked me, do I have a favorite genre of music and why? It's got to be the 80s, baby.
Well, for me too.
I'm an 80s child. I grew up with all of the hits of the 80s blasting through my veins and on the stereo and at my mother's step aerobics class. And so it's the 80s always. That's my fun music. That's when I'm on my drive home because I've got a 30-minute commute each way every day. And I need to decompress a little bit. You got to turn on Journey and belt out a little Don't Stop Believing. Or actually, Bill, I'm going to ask you. It's an Ask Us Anything, right? I'm going to ask you a question. What is your best beltable? If you're going to sing something and you're going to do it really loud, maybe off key, what is your favorite beltable tune?
I got to think about that. I don't know if I know the answer to that one off the top of my head.
Okay. Is there anything you find yourself singing out loud, maybe just every time you hear it on the radio?
Oh, sure. Our go-to is also music from the 80s.
Okay.
For us, it's more alternative. Mm-hmm. So it's Elvis Costello. It's The Pretenders.
Okay.
It's rock and pop from that era. I'm more of a guitar guy. Pamela, my partner, is much more of a synth girl. She likes Order and Depeche Mode and stuff like that. And I like that stuff too, but I'm a bit more of a rocker, and I'd be much more likely to put on The Clash.
Idol.
But then Billy Idol, for example, that's a nice intersection of synthy stuff and guitar. Steve Stevens is Billy Idol's longtime guitar player. That stuff's a big favorite.
Nice. That is going to wrap it up for this episode of Ask Us Anything, Colonial Parkway Murders and Assorted Other Topics edition. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next time.
Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawl Space Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.